Well, our next speaker is Dr. Mark Kleiman, Professor of Public Policy and the Director of Crime Reduction and the Justice Initiative at New York University's Marin Institute of Urban Management. In addition to his teaching duties, he is a member of the Committee on Law and Justice of the National Research Council and a co-editor of the Journal of Drug Policy Analysis. Dr. Kleiman received a master's degree and a PhD in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and directed the Justice Department's Office of Policy Management and Analysis. He is the author of 5 books on drug policy and criminal justice, and his talk today is Cannabis Use is Not a Brain Disease, and It Doesn't Matter Anyway, Science and Policy in the Legalization Debate. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kleiman.
Thanks very much. I'm going to deviate a little bit from my announced topic, or rather I'm going to come into my announced topic crab-wise. I want to talk about where we are now on the cannabis legalization debate, and then how the brain model of addiction, I think, largely doesn't help us get to the right place in terms of policy. So, cannabis, the largest illicit market in the United States, now about $40 billion a year, most widely used illicit drug. What we would gain from legalization is we would abolish the illicit market. We'd take that $40 billion away from the bad guys. We'd eliminate about 600,000 arrests per year for cannabis possession. Not a lot of incarceration, but those are a lot of arrests, and arrests has very large impacts on people's lives. Somehow it's escaped the public health community that arrest is not a safe or effective treatment for cannabis use disorder, and certainly not for not having cannabis use disorder. So that's the big gain. We would get rid of the illicit market and the need to enforce against it. The big loss is we would expect increasing substance use disorder around cannabis as a result of increased availability, decreased stigma, and very greatly decreased price. So 2 facts, it seems to me, about the cannabis situation ought to dominate all of our thinking. First is what we've heard earlier today about all the addictive disorders. Most people who engage in a potentially addictive behavior do not become addicted. The vast majority of users of any addictive drug, except nicotine in the form of cigarettes, aren't addicted to it. But the 80% of people who do not have a problem account for 20% or less of the market. So that the revenue in the market is going to be driven by the people with a drug problem. And the market is therefore, the industry is therefore going to shape itself around the need to build addicts and satisfy their demands. In the case of cannabis, people who use a lot of it get tolerant to THC. They want a very potent product. That's in fact what's available in both the medical and the commercial stores in California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado. Everybody I know my age who still smokes pot complains that the stuff is way too strong. And you want to know, well, how come there's not an industry in serving their needs? And the answer is because they want to smoke once a week, and who cares what they want? So the 80-20 rule means that the market is going to be driven toward more and more potent product. The other key fact is that one of the many synonyms for cannabis in English, somebody pointed out that there are more words in English that mean cannabis than there words are in Inuit that mean snow. One of the many synonyms for cannabis in English is weed. And that's a good label. It's a weed. It's a very easy plant to grow. John Calkins and Bo Kilmer have done a bunch of work trying to imagine what it would be like to grow cannabis if it were completely legal. And so what would a joint cost if it were a legal product? Well, what legal products does a joint look like? It's the dried flowers and leaves of a plant and a little bit of a wrapping. Sounds a lot like a tobacco cigarette. Jinling will sell you as many tobacco cigarettes as you like for a penny apiece. Most of the price of a cigarette in the US is brand profit and tax, but the actual production cost is epsilon. The other product that sounds like, legal product that sounds like, is a tea bag, which again will cost you about 2 cents in the supermarket. Everybody in the cannabis business denies this because they're still growing it using craft production means, but Calkins points out that half of the cannabinoids in a cannabis plant are in the leaves, not the flowers. they're now essentially thrown away. The most effective way to produce THC, most cost-effective way to produce THC would be growing big cannabis plants that look like corn plants on farms in Iowa, harvesting it with a combine, stripping off the leaves, extracting the cannabinoids, and either selling those as concentrates or re-injecting them into the flowers to make whatever kind of super pot you want to make. It looks, based on the numbers they put together, that a joint would cost a nickel, maybe less, cheap enough so that a restaurant could put out joints next to the sugar packets if they wanted to encourage the munchies. A friend of mine in the restaurant business says, no, of course nobody would ever do that because you'd increase your food consumption, but you'd really kill your turnover. But we're looking at, a joint now costs about $4, that is, the cannabis in a joint is about $4 worth. Of modern cannabis for a non-tolerant user, one joint's probably good for 2 pretty thorough intoxications. So you're looking at $1 an hour stoned, or a little bit less. That's cheaper than beer. Beer's a more expensive intoxicant than that. Now we're looking at a possible order and a half of magnitude decrease in the price. That's not going to matter at all to casual users. It's going to matter a lot to heavy users. And it's going to matter to poor people and children. So the price collapse that naturally comes from legalization is a very undesirable side effect. This comes against a background of, it's not well known yet, but it will be, a very, very, very large growth in particularly heavy cannabis use in the US over the past 2 decades. Paper just out in JAMA like a day ago shows something like a doubling of cannabis prevalence and a constant level of substance use disorder as a fraction of cannabis prevalence. I think they're defining substance use disorder a little bit too broadly. John Calkins and one of his students using the National Household Survey report based on current data. There are about 40 million people in the US who will say they used cannabis in the last year. About half of those will say they used in the last month. When you ask, how many days did you use in the last month of those people who did use, that's the number that changed a lot. So in 1992, about 10% of past month users reported daily or near daily use, defined as 25 days or more per month of cannabis use, whereas we technically call it chronic zonking. That fraction is now 40%. Of all the people who say in a survey they used cannabis in the last month, 40% used every day or almost every day. And of those people, when you look at the diagnostic questions that are asked in the household survey, about half meet criteria. Now, it's striking that people can smoke every day and not meet criteria for substance use disorder, but so it is. Now, why has heavy use in particular gone up so much? Well, the effective price of cannabis has fallen in the sense that the same $300 ounce that cost $300 20 years ago now has 4 or 5 times as much THC in it. So if you're looking at buying hours of intoxication, the price of an intoxicated hour has fallen. The stigma has fallen. The availability has gone up, particularly in the states with open medical marijuana. And attitudes have changed. An extraordinary thing about cannabis, and this somehow does not usually get mentioned in the debate. There are lots, or at least lots of us think, we ought to compare cannabis use to alcohol use. I think that's a reasonable comparison to make. But they're different on one very important dimension. Most people who have a drink do not intend to get drunk and do not in fact get drunk on that occasion. Typical drinking session is a drink or 2. Now, that doesn't change the fact that half of all drinks are consumed as part of drinking binges, because again, a small number of people who drink a lot overwhelm a large number of people who drink a little bit. But still, the modal pattern of alcohol use in this country is use not to intoxication. It's use as part of another social experience. Most people who smoke pot smoke to get stoned. That's what they'll say they're doing. We're getting stoned. Not true, probably, of many of the very heavy users who are so completely tolerant that they're smoking merely to maintain. But we really shouldn't compare our cannabis use statistics with drinking. We should compare it with binge drinking. And as somebody pointed out earlier today, binge drinking is sort of a weird phrase. I mean, it doesn't mean a lost weekend. Binge drinking is getting drunk. It's 5 or more drinks for a man, 4 or more for a woman. So if we just called it getting drunk, I think everybody would understand what I mean. Smoking pot is more like getting drunk than it is like just drinking. So it seems to me likely that legalization, if we allow it to involve aggressive marketing and big price decreases, will substantially worsen an already bad pattern of greatly increasing cannabis use disorder. Oh, I should have said among the causes of increased cannabis use disorder, the higher potency product that's now on the market is almost certainly, I would say certainly, a greater risk for adverse reactions, panic, hyperanxiety, ED visits, than the milder stuff that used to be around. Partly because it has more THC in it and therefore it comes in more quickly, partly because it has less cannabidiol. Cannabidiol is another chemical in cannabis. It seems to act as a buffer. It's anxiolytic, it's antipsychotic. Biologically, at the plant level, THC and CBD compete for precursors. And so the people who've been breeding super pot have not only been breeding the THC up, they've been breeding the CBD out. So a lot of products in the California medical dispensaries report trace amounts of CBD. So this stuff is certainly more risky for acute adverse reactions. I'm prepared to bet a lot it's more risky for dependency, but I don't think anybody's done that study yet. So I would say there is a case for legalization. I would say that prohibition is broken and cannot be fixed. Nobody's going to want to do the enforcement that would be required to put that $40 billion genie back in the bottle. So it'll admit that prohibition is over and ask what we're going to replace it with. What could that be? Well, that could be taxes and production controls to keep prices up. I don't see any reason to let the price of cannabis fall below its current illicit market level. Limits on marketing. And my personal favorite, which I mentioned earlier in the context of gambling, would be a personal user quota. In order to buy cannabis, I think you should have to pass your cannabis test the way you pass your driving test. And when they're done with that, the clerk should say to you, or the machine should say to you if you're doing it online, okay, you answered 16 out of the 20 multiple choice questions correctly, congratulations. You're now eligible to be a cannabis buyer of the Commonwealth of Virginia. You'll remember from the questions that 10 milligrams of THC is roughly an intoxicating dose for a naive user. How often do you want to do that every month? Because we're now asking you to set your personal quota of THC. And every time you go in to buy, you have to present your card. By the way, card needn't even have your name on it, just have a number on it. Present your card. The clerk will have to verify that you're an eligible buyer, that you have quota left this month, and then whatever you buy will come off your quota, just like it comes off your credit limit, right? This is not a technologically hard problem. Visa controls my credit use at 200 million merchants worldwide. And if you're trying to buy more THC than you said you wanted to be allowed to buy this month, the clerk's going to have to say, I'm sorry, that transaction was declined, just like you're over your credit limit. Now look, anybody who really wants to be a chronic zonker can simply set himself a high limit. And people ought to have the right to change their limit on, say, a week's notice. But that system would at least slow people down in their development of substance use disorder. Most people don't start using cannabis intending to be daily stoners. Again, I have no idea whether that would in fact work, but it seems to me it's a chicken soup policy. It couldn't hurt. But that's not where we're going. we are in the process of lurching from prohibition to a fully commercial legalization. John Calkins, my co-author on the cannabis book, was in the Netherlands presenting to a group of Dutch drug policy people, law professors and economists and so on, in 2010, when Prop 19, the legalization proposition, was on the California ballot. It wasn't very different from what later passed in Washington and Colorado. And he described to these pro-legalization people the contents of Proposition 19. And they said, "You're kidding, right? Nobody would be stupid enough to propose that we treat cannabis the way we treat alcohol, with big companies aggressively marketing to as many addicts as they can make. If you're going to make cannabis legal, you ought to make it legal in a rather moderate way, the way they have in the Netherlands." But that's not where we're going. We're going to lurch from prohibition, which I think in the current situation is the worst policy we could have, toward commercialization, which I think in the current situation is the second worst policy we could have. Now, when I give this talk, I get fairly good support for it. People are polite. And a couple people have even asked me, well, if I wanted to support a temperate cannabis policy, what organization would I join? And the answer is there is no such organization. Actually, interesting, the National Organization of the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, has some sympathy with temperate policies, but they're prepared to go for full legalization if that's what they can get. So why is there no such movement? I would suggest three important reasons. One is polarization. In a world where the war on drugs crowd and the government and the parents' movement have been telling massive lies about cannabis for 50 years now, it's not surprising that the legalization movement feels equally extreme. And in fact, some of those people will tell you in private, well, yeah, of course, what we say isn't strictly true, but the other side tells much worse lies and they have much more resources. So we're justified in matching their fairy stories about how dangerous cannabis is with the claim that cannabis never killed anybody. So the pro-legalization side is in a situation where they know, particularly running initiative campaigns, if you admit that there's any disadvantage to the policy you're proposing, it fails. Voters want a free lunch. And so the advocates of legalization are forced to deny that there is such a thing as cannabis use disorder. After all, don't you know it's a natural herb that never killed anybody? So they don't want to play that game. And the drug warriors, who you might want to think would compromise given that they're losing, might if there were a drug warrior central that got to make decisions. But think of it from the career point of view of somebody who works for a police department or works for the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Are they going to forward their career by telling their fellow drug warriors, guys, we lost, we better compromise? Or are they going to be better off as individuals going down with the ship? The initiative process, right? None of these cannabis legalization measures has passed through a legislature. These all passed by initiative. That completely changes the nature of the process, right? These things are being written by pollsters for maximum simplicity. What Einstein said about physics theories, I think, is true about laws. They ought to be as simple as possible, but no more so. The level of complexity that I'd want to put into a set of cannabis regulations is not anything you can explain on a bumper sticker or a 30-second TV spot. It's not going to survive the initiative process. And also the people who are putting the money into the initiatives are either fanatics or they're industry participants. They don't have any particular interest in coming up with a temperate policy. And again, they can probably win even with a somewhat intemperate one. And finally, the cannabis lobby is now moving up next to the cannabis movement as a source of funding, and their interests are different from the public interest. I actually met the guy who had just been hired as the new national lobbyist for the, I'm not making this up, National Cannabis Industries Association. This is last January in Washington. He was literally wearing a camel's hair coat. I didn't know there were real camel's hair coats like outside the movies. It's like they'd called Central Casting and said, send us a sleazy lobbyist. Guy used to work for ALEC, which is the Koch brothers funded network of state legislators to write reactionary laws. And then he was on the Republican staff of the House Commerce Committee. He should be writing the cannabis laws once this stuff is legal. So really, a temperate policy does not have a snowball's chance, except the Vermont legislature told the Vermont governor, we want to report on options for cannabis legalization. And the governor turned to the Rand Corporation, and I got sucked into that process. And so a bunch of us wrote a book for Vermont on options for cannabis legalization, laying out all the things in between prohibition and commercialization. And Vermont is actually, the Vermont legislature this year is going to consider a cannabis bill, and I'm told that it might actually pass. And that bill might actually be a moderate bill. And we just saw that the Liberals got back into power in Canada on a platform, among other things, of cannabis legalization. As far as I can tell, they haven't specified that. But we're now going to have a bunch of smart Canadian civil servants writing a bill that's going to have to go through hearing in the Parliament. It's entirely possible that Canada will give us a picture of national cannabis legalization that's not on the alcohol model. So I'm not completely in despair on this. So what do we get from the opposition to cannabis legalization? We get brain porn. We got arguments that cannabis is addictive and here's an fMRI to prove it. I think it's pretty bad science, terrible logic, and awful politics. I think the brain disease model of addiction picks out one feature of it, not necessarily the most important feature. It was invented not for scientific reasons, but because Alan Leshner wanted to destigmatize addiction and figured, well, calling it a brain disease had destigmatized schizophrenia. Maybe we could do the same thing for drug addiction. Still the case that nobody can show you a brain scan and say, okay, this guy's addicted and that guy's not addicted. Even if it were true that substance use disorder could be correctly categorized as a brain disease, it still wouldn't justify prohibition, right? I mean, nobody's proposing to prohibit alcohol or nicotine. So it's a complete jump from cannabis use disorder as a brain disease to cannabis should remain illegal, and yet that's what the drug warriors, including the director of NIDA, keep saying. And finally, it's terrible politics. I mean, anybody who believes that stuff is already against cannabis legalization, and that turns out not to be a majority anymore. By crying wolf about the dangers of cannabis back when it wasn't very dangerous, the drug warriors, I think, have completely shot their wad politically. So I don't think that set of arguments is going to get you much of anywhere. They're doing a little bit better on the cannabis damages the growing brain, which is a better argument and better scientifically supported. But again, I think it all gets lost in the general lack of credibility of federal agencies to tell people that cannabis will make hair grow on your palms or whatever it is they're saying this week. And again, I think that that making addictiveness a kind of magical quality of a few chemical substances rather than understanding it as a variety of bad habit, which is familiar to all of us, makes the discourse harder to understand. We know that contingencies matter. We know that price matters. We know that availability matters. We know that you can get a methamphetamine addict, that is, say, a heavy chronic methamphetamine user who would like to quit but has a hard time quitting. You can get him to quit much better if you pay him $10 for every clean urine. We know that people who are in the criminal justice system, who are randomly but frequently tested, and given very mild sanctions for every positive drug test, stop using about 80% of them. Without everybody touching the brain. I mean, somehow people have forgotten what Aristotle said a long time ago, which is that the organ of vision is the eye, the organ of hearing is the ear, the organ of the mind, the psyche, is the whole body. And the fact that something exists as a brain disease doesn't mean you need to mess with neurons directly to influence it. We can change the behavior around that brain disease by manipulating social contingencies. We are in the process of lurching from prohibition to commercialization. I think that lurch is not logically necessary. There are lots of other things you could do short of full commercialization. I think it's suboptimal. One of the standard AA lines is that insanity consists of repeating the same action and expecting a different result. Why should we expect that the policy we pursued with alcohol, and which has been disastrous with respect to alcohol, will do a better job with cannabis? That is to say, setting up a situation where lots of smart people are spending all of their time trying to create and maintain addiction, because that's the name of their market. Why should we expect it to do any better job with cannabis? Now, I don't think it will do as bad a job with cannabis, because cannabis is just not as dangerous as alcohol in most dimensions. But it's plenty dangerous enough, so we shouldn't mess with it. And unfortunately, I think that lurch is supported by the brain disease model. I think using the brain disease model to think about addiction makes it very hard to understand that we could have regulations rather than prohibitions. I think in the US, it's probably inevitable now that we're going to wind up with a national legalization, probably sometime in Hillary Clinton's second term, that's going to be more or less the commercial alcohol model. I don't see anything in the way of that. People keep asking about what the outcomes have been of commercial legalization in Washington and Colorado. And by the way, I should have started by declaring my conflict of interest. My company has done work for Washington, just did some work for Jamaica. So every time somebody legalizes cannabis, I've got a potential payday coming. I don't think that changes my view on this very much, but it's certainly a financial conflict. I think it's probably inevitable in the US that we're going to get the wrong answer on this. And there are some people, Kevin Sabet, for example, who runs Smart Approaches to Marijuana, keep saying, oh no, cannabis legalization is going to have terrible outcomes, and there's going to be a backlash. And I say, no, that's not going to happen. Not because I don't think there are going to be some terrible outcomes. They're not going to develop on a time course that will influence the politics. And they're not going to arrive in social classes that matter. There's a story about a guy who jumps off a tall building, and as he passes the 42nd floor, somebody yells out to him, how's it going? And he yells back, so far, so good. That's my reaction when people say, well, they legalized in Colorado and the sky didn't fall. Well, yeah, the sky hasn't fallen yet, but the prices haven't fallen yet. When we get down to retail cannabis at $3 a gram, I think we're going to see much different outcomes than we're seeing now, but we're going to see them mostly among poor children. And I doubt that's going to matter to anybody much politically. On the other hand, Uruguay has legalized in a very different approach. Canada may legalize with a very different approach. I think there's reasonable hope that around the world somebody will come up with a temperate cannabis policy, and we should all be watching. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you. That was a great talk, and it was refreshing not to see PowerPoint slides and just to hear someone speak, and you did that nicely. My question is your characterization of the anti-legalization folks, I think it's certainly fair to say they've overstated risks, and they certainly haven't been very politically savvy. But to refer to them as the drug warriors, I don't know if that's fair. I don't follow this closely, but what I hear them say is that they're really anti-commercialization, and that I even hear them say they're in favor of decriminalization. I don't hear them saying we should be locking up marijuana smokers.
No, that's correct. And it's in fact been interesting to watch the anti-cannabis forces sort of draw back from their radical positions, right? So the parents groups that are, among the main players here were founded in the 70s to oppose decriminalization. They are now proposing decriminalization as what we should do instead. But it's not really all that convincing. And you might have expected that some of them would say, okay, well, if we're going to legalize, we ought to do it in the following way. And National Families in Action, Sue Rushi, has thrown off a sort of parallel group called What About the Children? So they've got a website, whataboutthechildren.org, which listed a bunch of criteria for cannabis legalization, including if cannabis use goes up at all, then we repeal the legalization. And I suggested that they should, just for fairness, also propose that any state where cannabis was illegal, where cannabis use went up, then they should repeal the prohibition. I have not found anybody from that side of the argument prepared to say, okay, here's what we would actually accept. So for example, DC passed a thing called Grow and Give. Any adult can grow cannabis at home and give away up to an ounce. Now that seems to me like a pretty good approach to temperate legalization. Not clear that it's enough to really wipe out the illicit market, because I think most people would just rather get it than grow it. But still, it's a piece of legalization that doesn't threaten any of the things that I'm worried about. And not a single one of the anti-legalization groups came out for that. Now, the people who wrote it were assuming that the DC government would take the next step of creating a commercial system. Congress forced them to back off that. So we're stuck with the system that the legalizers didn't want and that the anti-legalizers didn't want. But it looks to me like a pretty attractive system, and as far as I know, I'm the only one who's for it. No, it's certainly true that not everybody who's against cannabis legalization wants to lock up everybody in sight. But they're mostly people who started out that way. I mean, I guess John Calkins, my co-author on this stuff, is pretty firmly anti-legalization historically. But again, John and I don't have any divisions. There's not a group that supports a temperate version of legalization. This reminds me of Jim Hightower. Jim Hightower was the last surviving liberal in Texas politics before Ms. Davis came along. And Hightower once said, "There ain't nothing in the middle of the road but yellow lines and dead armadillos." So you're looking at roadkill.
I work with drug treatment and been doing that for many years, especially with offenders coming out of the system. I introduced in-house drug treatment groups to the Department of Corrections 20-some years ago. The point I would make is it's a lost war. We're getting legalization regardless of the costs. But it's self-evident that if nicotine combustible is a health hazard, then marijuana combustible must be in that class as well, and has more complicated medicinal impacts than nicotine does. So we're looking at a exaggeration, an increase of distribution. We're looking at an increase of health risks involved with medical and non-medical marijuana. We're looking at anything that in fact increases that as costing the gross national product as alcohol has since the abolition of the restriction of its use. So we're looking at a really dangerous situation. It's a minefield. The war is lost, and I agree with you on that. But I think we ought to really be aware of the costs that we're incurring.
I'm with you on that. A couple things to add to it, though. It's true that cannabis smoke has a lot of bad stuff in it. But a very, very, very heavy cannabis user might use 3 joints a day. The typical cigarette smoker uses 20 cigarettes a day. So the lung insult from cannabis is not going to rise to the level of the lung insult from nicotine. And in fact, it's very hard to find evidence of serious respiratory problems directly related to cannabis use. Now, that's partly because so many of the cannabis smokers are also cigarette smokers. And one of the big risks of cannabis legalization that nobody but John Calkins is screaming about is that we're likely to get combination use. So we may get a secondary increase in nicotine use as a result of the increase in cannabis use. But another consequence of legalization is, and we're seeing this very strongly in the states that have already legalized either commercially or medically, is a sharp move away from combustible toward vaporizable concentrates and toward edibles and potables. I think it's true now that less than half of the market in Washington and Colorado is flowers. So the lung insult's likely to go way down as a result of a shift to vaping. What we don't know is what's going to happen to total cannabis consumption as a result. The other thing that's, they want to be hopeful about this, all the states that have legalized are requiring testing and labeling, so that the consumers are going to have some idea, which they've never had before, at least which active chemicals they're taking. And it's possible that once people can buy product with CBD in it, some are going to want that. And that's probably going to be safer. The other thing is, if we've got a vaping device that produces a measured puff, doesn't matter what size that puff is, produces a measured puff, and we've got butane hash oil or some other extract with a known cannabinoid profile, then for the first time historically, somebody's going to be able to take a measured dose of cannabis, right? I mean, in some ways, controlling your drinking is relatively easy. You count your drinks. There is no cannabis equivalent of a drink right now. And one thing you'd like to see about a temperate policy is moving toward people being aware of what a dose is and how many of them they've had. So there's lots of regulatory stuff we could do here, but I think just like the gambling industry, the cannabis industry is going to make it impossible to do anything that would interfere with drug abuse, because that's their business.
My particular concern is how the restriction on research in cannabis has driven all the research pretty much out of this country. And I wondered if you'd comment on a bill, which I assume you know recently came up, which is a bipartisan bill to create a new schedule just to allow research on cannabis. It was so bipartisan that the congressman who tried to block cannabis in D.C., it was supporting it because he's so convinced that there's no medical use. The whole process then just seemed to end in an arbitrary way. Did you have any sense of what happened? Comment about that?
The basic problem is that whoever invented the scheduling system under the Controlled Substances Act, if he wasn't stoned at the time, had no excuse at all. Because the scheduling system makes absolutely no logical sense. It defines a Schedule I drug as having high abuse potential and no medical use. It defines a Schedule II drug as having high abuse potential and some medical use, and then 3, 4, and 5 are supposed to be lower risk than Schedule II, all within the world of medical use, right? Well, that means that a drug that has moderate abuse potential and no currently accepted medical use finds no place in the schedules. And the administrators simply decided, we're going to put them all in Schedule I. Cannabis doesn't really belong in Schedule II unless it has accepted medical use, And the way the courts have upheld the administrative decisions, just the fact that a lot of people are smoking what they think is medical marijuana isn't accepted medical use. It would matter only a little bit to the research process if cannabis were moved to Schedule II. It's a little bit less onerous to get approval for a Schedule II piece of research, particularly a lot of IRBs really don't like Schedule I. So that would matter a little bit. What would matter a lot more is to break the University of Mississippi monopoly so that there were multiple potential producers. I mean, a big problem in producing genuinely medical cannabis products, right? I mean, my view is medical marijuana is, at the moment, is a joke. Because nobody's got a product of known and reproducible chemical profile. If I've got an infection, my internist does not say to me, I heard that antibiotic might be good for infection. I recommend that you take some antibiotic. No, she hands me a prescription for 100 milligrams of amoxicillin 3 times a day with meals for 7 days. That's medicine. Blow some weed is not medicine. And nobody can develop a reproducible strain of cannabis unless they can actually run that farm, right? So the notion that people should be developing medical cannabis products in the US is absurd. They can't get the material for it. They can never show good manufacturing practice. So that's the main thing I'd want to get out of the way, is break that monopoly so that people can have multiple cannabis, multiple production facilities for lots of other scheduled drugs, and let people do the real medical stuff. The problem is that the medical marijuana racket is going to be destroyed by full commercial legalization. And so is the actual research, right? So GW Pharma, that makes Sativex, is not enthusiastic about the notion that herbal cannabis is going to be legal in the US. They're not going to have any market for it. It'd be very hard to compete pharmaceutically with something that costs pennies a dose. So I'm a little discouraged on that front.